Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Want to thank you all for being on this evening. My name is Patrick Davis. I'm a University of Missouri Extension Regional Livestock Field Specialist in the Stockton, Missouri area, which is in Southwest Missouri. And I'm kind of myself, along with Jill Scheidt, who's a regional agronomy field specialist with MU Extension, Tim Schnockenberg, who's a regional agronomy field specialist with MU Extension, and Wesley Tucker, who's a regional ag business field specialist with MU Extension. We're involved in planning this online hay school. And so want to thank you all for being on. About an hour and a half ago, I sent out an email with information, the handouts for tonight, the presentation slides and the handouts for tonight. And so hopefully you got that, as well as other information related to the hay school, the 3-night hay school. And so right now we've got showing the agenda, what's going to take place tonight, Thursday night, and then a week from tonight. And so tonight we're going to start out with Jill talking about, she's going to give kind of an introduction and talk about forages for Southwest Missouri and hay. And then I will finish up the evening talking about forage quality and cattle nutrition. And so with that, kind of a couple of things for this evening. Basically, the best way to ask questions is through the chat. There's a chat button on there. We'll periodically stop throughout the presentations and ask for questions, but probably the best way to do that is to ask those questions through the chat. And one of us will be monitoring the chat, and as we go through the presentations tonight, we'll bring those questions up and answer those as best we can. Also, if you have video, please turn that off so that we can, hopefully we don't use up too much bandwidth, because I know in some places it's hard to, internet speed's a little hard to come by, and that can affect the ability to watch the meeting. And so basically we've got one thing here in the chat. Let's see what we got. With that, can't think of anything else. Probably on the last night, I will provide an evaluation for the 3-night hay school. We'll have an electronic evaluation that I'll send to you via email that you can send back anonymously, as well as a PDF form evaluation that you can fill out and send back electronically. And so, of course, if you have any questions or anything, just let us know with that. And also, I am recording this evening, And so the video of tonight's presentation will be sent to you the same way that you received your the information to log into the meeting through the registration platform. So once I get the video downloaded and everything, they will send that directly to you. Probably get that hopefully out tomorrow, but we'll see how that works. But anyway, with that said, I think we're probably ready to start with Jill. And like I said, if you have any questions or anything, type those in the chat, and we'll try to move on here and get done in a pretty decent hour. So. That Jill.
Ready for me, Patrick?
Yep, I'm ready for you.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just go ahead and get us started here. Just let me know if you can't hear me well, and I'll try to change my speakers here if that's a problem. I'm Jill Scheidt. I'm an agronomy field specialist headquartered in Barton County. I serve Barton, Jasper, Newton, McDonald, and Dade counties. So if you are joining us from any of those counties tonight, I'm your agronomy specialist, and you see my contact information there on the screen if you need to get a hold of me for any questions. Patrick, it's not letting me. Oh, there we go. All right. So today we know that anymore, the way that we produce hay is by big round bales or sometimes big square bales. We don't really see a whole lot of small squares anymore. And, you know, there was good reason for that. It allowed us to have a lot less labor and pick up the speed of harvest. You know, one person can pretty much cut, rake, bale, haul, and store the hay. It doesn't take, you know, more than one person. You know, but the downside to this is that there's a lot less attention given to the quality of the hay that gets put into that bale, and more emphasis on the volume. So it's more important to us anymore, you know, how many bales are in the field, how many bales did we get off the acre. And then also, you know, we have a lot more opportunity to have outside storage, which has also led to increased storage losses that, you know, we don't always tend to think about. So a statement has been made by Rob Kallenbach. He used to be our state forage specialist, that 50% of Missouri hay may never make it into the belly of a cow. And there's a lot of different losses that go into factor there, and we'll look at those. So, you know, we could have anywhere from 10 to 30% of our forage lost through field curing, just because, you know, when it dries down, not all of it gets back into the baler. When we're harvesting it, you know, raking it up, putting it into the baler, we can't pick up every single blade of grass. Depending on what kind of storage we have, we can see 5 to 35% loss. Outside storage, of course, is going to be that higher percentage loss. And then depending on what our feeding practices we can see a lot of loss there as well. And so here's just some pictures, you know, to just illustrate a little bit more of that loss. And just, you know, it takes a lot of time and labor. Even though we're in the tractor, it's still a lot of time, you know, spent putting up those bales and money. So we need to make sure that we're getting the most out of them, so that, you know, we can put the most back into our cattle or our livestock. So here's another example. We have plenty of opportunity to store our hay outside now. Net wrap has become a great thing to kind of help us with that. But, you know, I just want to point out some things that we might see wrong with this picture. So there's the hay. It's stacked. It's under a tree, which, you know, you would typically think if it's raining, okay, you know, maybe it won't get rained on under the tree. But as you can see, under these trees, there's a lot of shade. And so those bales are still going to get wet, and it's going to take them a lot longer to dry out whenever they're under that tree when the sun's not shining on them and not evaporating that moisture. And then, of course, I don't know how evident it is, but you can probably see that that's a hill and that the hay is sitting at the bottom of the slope. So we know what happens whenever it rains. That rain's going to come down that slope and it's going to settle right there at the bottom of the hill, right where that hay tends to be or is, in fact, stored. So we just need to make sure, we're thinking about all aspects, and that's what we're going to cover in Hay School, just kind of trying to help you think about different aspects of hay making and how to help you get the most out of your hay. Some other things to think about with loss, it's not all about just what doesn't get into the baler or what doesn't get into the belly of that animal. It's also about the quality of that forage that gets there. Now, this happens to be this is actually a field of orchard grass. It's not fescue, but it does look like fescue. And as you all know, we see a lot of fescue put up like this. And that's just kind of the reality of what it is sometimes in Missouri when it gets to raining in the spring. But really that's that kind of hay. If we're here in this stage of growth, of maturity, we really probably shouldn't be putting up this kind of hay, because that's a lot of stem and not a lot of leaf material and not a lot of nutrients that is going to our animals. So, we've got to think about the quality of the hay that we're putting up as well, not just how we're storing it or how we're baling it. And so, to talk a little bit more about quality, it is important to test your hay. You need to know what you have, so that way you know what to feed and can make up rations based off of that need or what your hay is or isn't providing your animals. So here's just a chart, and I think Patrick's going to go over this more later, but I'm just going to briefly go over it. So this is looking at fescue quality based on time of cutting and what it's going to provide for our animals. So if you look here at the first top column, if we cut our hay in that late boot to head stage, kind of that ideal stage, we're not getting as much pounds per acre as we are if we wait until, it's headed out, the seeds forming, you get about twice as much or a little bit more if you wait till later. But if you kind of follow that chart more to the right, you're going to see that our protein and digestibility are much higher in that higher quality hay that's cut earlier. Our livestock are going to take in more pounds per day, the average daily gain. Now, Wesley's going to talk a little bit more about economics, so I'm not going to steal any of his thunder. But if you just look right there, average daily gain, they're getting 3 times as much weight gain on half the amount of hay. And so you're feeding half the amount of hay to get 3 times the amount of gain. So that in itself is economics there. You can do your own math on that and know which one's the better hay quality as far as economics go and efficiency, which one you want to feed. So I think, instead of thinking about bales per acre, we need to switch our thoughts and not even think about, we think about dry ton per acre, but let's even go deeper and think about pounds of energy per acre, our net return per acre, and our net return per cow or per whatever livestock it is that we're feeding. So this is kind of what Hay School is about. We want you to
Jill, we lost your sound. Jill?
Patrick, I texted her just in case she couldn't hear us to let us.
Okay.
Texted her. We lost her sound.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Where did I stop?
Back one slide, I believe.
Okay. Okay, so basically, just because you have a lot of bales in the field doesn't mean you had a good hay crop. You know, we want you to start thinking about more about what you're putting into that livestock. So here's an illustration, just looking at what early harvested hay looks like versus our more mature late harvested hay. As you can see, the cell wall is thinner in the early harvested hay versus a thicker cell wall, which equals, you know, more fiber, tougher, you know, tougher forage to break down. So there's going to be lower intake, low energy return on that kind of hay. Something I like to use, you know, if I was in person, what I would show people is, you know, think about your favorite candy bar. And let's say that candy bar just happens to be really nutritious for you. So I'm going to give you that candy bar, and that would be just unwrapped. There you go. You have your candy bar. That's like early harvested hay. Now, if we had late harvested hay, I'm going to take that candy bar, I'm going to leave it in the wrapper, and then I'm going to put it in a paper bag, and I'm going to hand it to you and say, enjoy it. I hope you really like this candy bar. You got to eat through the bag as well as the wrapper, and you got to eat all of that as well as the candy bar. That's what you got to do to eat your candy bar and get all those nutrients. And if you think about that, well, that's not going to taste that great. You're not going to eat that much of it because it's going to take you a lot of energy to kind of get it down, and you're really just not going to enjoy it. So that's kind of what I like to illustrate or have people think about whenever they're thinking about early harvested hay versus late harvested hay. And of course, you know, I'm talking about, oh, you need to harvest your hay in May. And I know you're thinking, well, she doesn't know anything because she must not be from Missouri. Well, I know our problem here in Missouri. We get rain. We get rain during the spring and we get a lot of it. And sometimes that messes up our hay. And so sometimes the reality of things is although we'd like to get our hay harvested in May, you know, some of us may strive for that. Sometimes the reality is our weather just doesn't allow us to do that. So, you know, what are we going to do about it? Maybe we need to think about a different way of doing things. Maybe we kind of switch our paradigm to help us produce better hay. So let's talk about some of those strategies for just a little bit. So of course, you know, the first thing we can do is just keep doing what we've always done. I know it's hard to change. It's kind of scary to change. But you know, if you don't take a shot at something, we're not going to know if it's any better or worse. So something else we could try is wrapped baleage. You know, essentially, if we look at the computer that's in our pocket that can tell us the forecast, just pull out your phone, look at it. If you've got a day or two of nice weather, you know, and economically wrapped baleage works out for your farm, it's a good choice because essentially we can be in and out of the field in about 24 hours. Wrapped baleage allows us to harvest our hay and put it up into a bale with a lot more moisture, more like 50 to 60% moisture versus that 18% moisture that we want to wait for in our big round bales. And, you know, then it has some good storage. You know, potentially if you get that bale wrapped good, you can store it outside and it will still be good hay that's been stored well. So, you know, that's something to think about. Of course, some drawbacks are you just kind of economically, it has to work for your farm. You have to make sure you get that bale wrapped good. You don't want any rips or tears because that can really lead to some fast spoilage if we get a lot of rips and tears in our silage strap bales. And then another option is we can do what I just talked about, trying to harvest a little bit earlier in April or early May. If we're looking at our forecast and we see 3 or 4 days of good weather in April, late April, early May, if we're able to take off those days, get that hay cut, put it up, because that's when our highest quality hay for like a cool season grass such as fescue is going to be. So, what you might look for on a late April or early May harvest, you're going to see lower yields like you saw in that chart I showed you earlier. But remember, you're going to have higher quality hay in that first cutting, as well as you're going to have an improved second cutting. The quality is still going to be higher in a second cutting of this early harvested hay than it would be if you waited until that fescue was mature. Now, there sometimes if it gets really warm and we harvest the hay a little bit too early, like a little bit earlier than the boot stage, we could still see some seed heads pop up in the second cutting. But as long as you're kind of waiting until that early boot stage, we shouldn't have any seed head problems in our fescue if we're going to do that early cutting. And then let's talk about kind of the hot topic right now. Warm season grasses are kind of all the rage in forage farming right now. So let's talk about those for just a little bit. We could plant ourselves a couple of paddocks of, or a couple of fields of warm season grasses. And those could be something that we could allow our cattle to graze in the spring and fall on our cool season grasses such as fescue. And then in the summer months, we could go ahead in June, whenever it's dry, when we typically are going out and putting up hay, fescue hay. When it's poor quality, we could be putting up high quality warm season grass when it's dry out, when we don't have to worry so much about lower quality hay and not worry so much about all of that rain. So that's another thing to think about, is converting some of those cool season fields or paddocks over into a cool season grass or a warm season grass. And so this is just kind of an illustration here of what I just talked about. Keep your cattle grazing or your livestock grazing during the fall and the spring. Allow that fescue field some rest during the summer months. Also keep the cattle off of it, during that time, because that's typically when we tend to see that, endophyte in the fescue cause a little bit more problems in our cattle. And then we could be putting up hay that's warm season grass there in June, or letting those cattle graze the warm season grass.
Jill, we got a couple questions. One question. What is the boot stage? How do I recognize this?
Sure. So I have a picture here later on, but I'll explain it now. It's kind of the head of the grass is just starting to come out of the stem. So it's not fully out of the stem and the seed head's not fully open yet. It's just kind of starting to come out of the stem. And I'll show you a picture of that later so you can kind of visualize it a little bit better. And I will talk about orchard grass and brome here in about 30 minutes. We're going to get to talking a little bit more about these different types of forages that we can use. So I'll get to that one as well. Thank you, Patrick.
Yep.
So the last option is to buy your hay. And Leslie is going to talk a lot more about this in the economics portion. So I'm not going to touch on it because, of course, I'm an agronomy specialist, so I don't know anything about money anyway. So the most important thing, though, I want to hit on here is if you're buying your hay, really, really know well the person that you are buying it from. Have a good relationship with them. Know what the hay tests. Know what's in the hay. Make sure you're not buying low quality hay. That's not going to do you any good. And make sure that you know what's in the hay. Make sure there's not a bunch of weed seeds, because if you are just putting down hay that's poor quality or hay that's got a bunch of weeds in it, you're just going to end up having a weed problem later on in your pasture. So, maybe after you listen to Hay School, you may decide you want to buy your hay instead of make it, because it's going to free up a lot of time and equipment. If you're just buying it, there's a lot of less equipment and time involved in that process. But the important thing here is just know the person you're buying it from really, really well, and just make sure you're getting quality hay. And Patrick is going to talk a lot more about knowing what quality hay is as well. So he'll cover that. So another thing I want to talk about is quality management. So the way that we manage quality in our forages, it depends on what our plant species is. Typically, our legumes have some really good quality that can supplement our grasses and conditions at harvest. So, did my fescue get rained on before it was put up? Those type of things you really can't control. The things you can control, like I said earlier, is making sure it's put up at the right time. So making sure we're putting it up at the right stage of growth. So Patrick's going to send you this. I'm not going to go over it really in detail, but basically here you can see a lot of our grasses. We want to put those up somewhere in the boot stage. With the exception of orchard grass, we're going to put that up. We're going to try to harvest it when the blooms emerge. A lot of our legumes are going to be somewhere just in early bloom stages. There is when the typical time to put them up for the highest quality. So this is the time, depending on what forage we have here, this is the time that you want to put those up to harvest them to get the highest quality. So if you have more questions on that, feel free to ask, but you'll have it in the slides that Patrick's going to send out to you. And here's that picture I was talking about that I would show you explaining boot stage. That fescue head there in the middle, that is an example of boot. So you can see there that the head is just kind of starting to come out of the stem. It's not opened up yet. It's not flowering. It's not opened up. That's kind of typically where we want to see the fescue when we're putting it up and harvesting it. And again, you will have that in your slide set that Patrick's going to send out to you. So that's a good picture and a good reference to look at to figure out where boot stage is. And depending on the species that we are harvesting, our stubble height can play a big role in the quality that we get as well. So here's some Sudan grass. And if you look here, we're looking at stubble height in this chart below. So there's a 1-inch stubble height compared to a 10-inch stubble height. And you can see here that as we go toward the right, if we leave a higher stubble height, we're going to get actually more tons per acre in our yield. And we're going to get a lot more leaf material, of course, because we're cutting higher on the plant. But it is important that we're getting more leaf versus stem, because the leaf is where, all of those nutrients are and the better digestibility, everything there. So, know your species, know kind of your cutting height is important in this too. I'll go into native warm season grasses later tonight as well. And we're going to talk about how we need to leave those at a higher stubble height as well to help them persist. But, don't just mow it to the ground. And we're going to talk about fescue and stubble height too, and how it recovers on low stubble height versus slightly higher. So we'll get there as well tonight. And okay, so here's what I wanted to show you about stubble height. This is actually a study done with orchard grass, but basically it translates over into fescue as well. So we had 2 plants of orchard grass selected, and they cut one at 1 inch and the other one at 3.5 inches. And they went ahead and for, I believe it was 4 weeks, they just made sure that plant height was always stayed continuously at 1 inch to simulate continuous grazing. And then the other plant, they just kept it 3.5 inch. So every time it grew, they just cut it back to 3.5 inches for about 4 weeks. And so I'm just going to flip through these to show you how well the grass recovers on a short stubble height versus a slightly higher one. So I think we can see here pretty easy, you know, what the better decision is as far as allowing our grasses to recover, even cool seasons. I know fescue, you know, we like to cut it close to the ground, but I'm telling you, if you just leave it raise up that mower just a little bit, if we leave a little bit more stubble, we're going to see your grass grow back a lot faster than if you just cut it straight to the ground. And the reason for that is once we get so short on our foliage, we start to lose root mass because it's trying to put all of its energy, the plant's trying to put all of its energy into growing those leaves, and so it's sloughing off roots. In turn, you know, that makes the plant less able to get nutrients and water because it has less root mass to collect from the soil. So, you know, just another thing to think about, you know, even if you're sticking with fescue, consider mowing it just a little bit higher so maybe your grass can grow back a little bit quicker. Because also, you know, if you think about it, even if you're cutting grass or cool season grasses at the right time, so if you're doing it in late April, early May, you know, we've got June and July coming right after that, and those are the hot months whenever the grasses aren't growing as much. And so giving them, you know, a jump start on growing and recovering is always a good idea. So let's say we have low quality forage. So there is something you can do to increase that quality a little bit. We can ammoniate our hay. It has to be low quality hay. If you don't have low quality hay, we can get some toxicities there to our livestock. If we don't have low quality hay, if we have high quality hay we're ammoniating, that can cause some problems in our livestock. So, you know, if you have low quality hay, cover it in black plastic, get anhydrous, weigh your bales, know how much they are, and apply 2.5% ammonia on our dry matter basis. And this can improve our intake, and it can increase our protein as well. So here's a picture of it. And at the Southwest Center a couple years ago in Mount Vernon, they did do a demonstration of ammoniating some low quality hay, and they showed the cattle eating it, and they liked it just fine. So this is something that you can consider if, you know, weather just doesn't go your way and you have to wait to harvest it in you know, that June time period. This is another option you can use. Another thing to think about with fescue, I'm sure, you know, most of you have heard about endophyte in fescue and how, you know, that affects cattle or affects livestock negatively. And so just something to think about here and consider is whenever you cut fescue, that level of ergovaline, it will drop drastically within the first few days after cutting, but that level still remains even for 18 months in stored hay. It goes down very, you know, very slow rate. it's not enough to really make a difference. And still, even though it's a lower rate of ergovaline, it's still enough to negatively affect cattle. So just something to think about. And also, I said it goes down slowly in 18 months. Well, I don't think many of us really want to keep our hay for 18 months. We're hoping that we don't have 18-month hay laying around that we're trying to feed our cows anyway. So at this time, I will pause for just a second and see if there are any questions. And if not, I'll go on, but I'll pause for just a few seconds here. And Patrick, are there any additional questions in the chat?
I do not see any.
Okay, well, again, if you have questions, as Patrick said, hover over the bottom of your screen. There'll be a pop-up box and the chat button should be there in the middle. If you have questions, feel free to ask those and Patrick will stop me. So let's talk about some of these different forages that we can use in Southwest Missouri for hay. So we've got a lot of different things. We're going to talk about cool season grasses, warm season grasses, winter annuals, summer annuals, and our legumes. So first, let's talk about our cool season grasses. So we have fescue, orchard grass, and perennial ryegrass that we could use. And as you all know, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this growth curve chart before, but in the spring with our cool seasons, we have a big spike in growth, followed by the summer slump there in June to about mid-August. And then in mid-August through November, we're going to see another little bump in growth, a secondary bump there where we can get some additional fall grazing out of our cool seasons. And as you can see, fescue typically tends to have the highest secondary fall bump compared to something like orchard grass or perennial ryegrass. So, most of you are familiar with fescue. Majority of our hay that's produced here is fescue. It's pretty hardy. It's pretty hard to kill, and it seems to come back pretty well for us. It has a good quality when it's harvested at the right time. And we also now have novel fescues, so that helps us combat our Kentucky 31 issues that we have there. And I'm just going to touch briefly on novel fescues here. So make sure if you are considering converting your Kentucky 31 to a novel fescue, you are not purchasing endophyte-free seed. You want to purchase endophyte-friendly seed or a novel fescue. Do not purchase endophyte-free. And the reason here is because some varieties, the endophyte-free, they just totally took the endophyte out. And while that's good for our livestock, the fescue plant still needs an endophyte to help it persist through, drought, disease, winter. And if it doesn't have an endophyte in it, it won't persist well, and we're just not going to see good results as far as persistence goes with our fescue. But the friendly endophyte or endophyte-friendly fescue still has an endophyte in it. They've replaced the bad endophyte with a good one that works with the cattle. So we still are, we're not seeing those negative effects of Kentucky 31 with the novel, and we're still getting the persistence that we desire in a fescue. Below, you can see some of the different varieties and brands of the novel fescues. And then there on the bottom of the screen, you'll see there was a 2-year study done in Fayetteville and Mount Vernon, and they compared the gain on Kentucky 31 or an endophyte fescue versus a novel fescue that had the friendly endophyte in it. And you can see, that's 2.5 times the weight gain there in Mount Vernon. That's pretty good. That's pretty good increase in weight gain there when we're not seeing those negative effects from the Kentucky 31.
Jill, I had a question. What's the best stubble height for fescue after cutting?
Sure. So I think, back if you were thinking about that orchard grass picture that I just showed, it was kind of that 3.5 inches. I think that would be fine.
Okay. Just had another.
I think that's.
Just had another question come in as well is if we're not grazing, would endophyte-free fescue be a good choice for hay production?
No, I would not recommend the endophyte-free fescue ever. It's not going to persist, especially, haying is a lot harder on our forages than grazing is. It takes out a lot more nutrients from the soil than grazing. So it's just, it's not going to persist. It's still, whether you're grazing or you're haying, that fescue still has to persist through the winter, has to persist through our droughts in Missouri. And, there's rust. I'm sure that you guys seen a lot of rust happen on fescue, and it tends to not, bother it most of the time. But if you had an endophyte-free fescue, that rust would become a problem for your fescue as well. So it just doesn't persist. It really needs the endophyte. The plant needs the endophyte to function as well.
Okay, that's all we got.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's talk about orchard grass now. So orchard grass is kind of the same as fescue. It starts producing here about the same time. It has quick regrowth. It doesn't have as much fall growth as fescue. Some drawbacks to orchard grass: it is more susceptible to drought and disease, and it's only going to last, maybe 3 to 5 years. 3 years, and kind of if we have, a hard winter or some droughts or whatever, like we normally do in Missouri, I would expect you would have to reseed maybe about every 3 to 5 years. And orchard grass is definitely not as forgiving as fescue to a low cutting height. So it's a great choice. You just have to make sure you manage it a little bit more carefully than fescue, as far as making sure the height's a little bit, taller, getting at that 3.5 inches or so stubble height whenever we are mowing it. So, there's some positives to orchard grass, and also a few drawbacks as well, just to think about, but I think you can manage through those drawbacks. Okay, now let's talk about brome grass. It is also a cool season. It's a little bit more later maturing than most of our cool seasons, and the good thing about it is it's resistant to drought. Again, make sure that you're cutting it at that higher stubble height so that you can encourage regrowth, because it is going to grow back a lot slower after haying. So it's probably not going to persist as long. You're probably going to have to expect to reseed it as well, kind of like your orchard grass, just because if you're always haying it, you're going to be taking out a lot of nutrients and kind of abusing it just a little bit more. So make sure that if you choose brome grass, just kind of the same rules as orchard grass, that you cut it a little bit higher and don't, overgraze it or cut it way low to the ground there. And as far as establishment goes, if you can just kind of make sure you don't have a weed problem, I think it'll be okay. Mostly with establishment, anytime establishment is difficult, it's just because we have to worry about making sure we've taken care of our weeds and make sure they're not competing with our new seedlings trying to come up. Annual ryegrass. So I used to have perennial ryegrass on here, and I left it off. I started taking it off because really it just doesn't persist very long. So I just kind of started to take it. I just started to leave it off, but I will talk about annual ryegrass. Some cautions here. It is considered an invasive weed, especially in wheat and fescue. So that's something to consider. If you have fescue pasture or hay fields around your annual ryegrass or a wheat field, you really need to, be careful or have a good relationship with your neighbors, because it can overtake the fescue. The good thing about it is it remains in the vegetative stage there pretty long, and it does reproduce by seed. So if you can cut it before the seed heads, are fully out and it starts dropping that seed, you really shouldn't have too much of a problem with it, you know, overtaking our fescue or anything like that, because it won't reproduce if it doesn't have that seed there on the ground. So, you know, it's another choice we could have if we wanted some, you know, some more grazing, or to have a chance to, you know, have it in the vegetative stage just a little longer. And I will note, I'm going to talk about cereal rye as well. There is a difference. There's cereal ryegrass, or there's cereal rye, and then there's ryegrass. And on the right side is our cereal rye. It looks, you know, like wheat seed because it's a cereal crop. And then on the left side is our ryegrass, and that looks like more like fescue, kind of, you know, that forage grass seed that we're looking at. So, you know, make sure when you're going into a place that if you ask for one or the other, you know what the seeds look like, so you know what you're buying there. So we also have some winter annuals that that we can choose from for haying or grazing. You know, these are kind of nice to give us some winter grazing, as well as maybe some earlier cuttings of hay if we wish. And then we'll just talk a little bit about cool season grass and alfalfa. You know, there are some people that like to put, you know, our fescue and alfalfa together, because as you can see, alfalfa does a really nice job of filling that summer slump it produces right there when fescue is not. So, you know, it can be a good match. Alfalfa is pretty expensive, and it does need high fertility and management. So it is really a good forage. I'm sorry, it's not a grass. It's a good forage to use for hay. And Eldon Cole and Patrick Davis and Tim, they'll all tell you, you know, alfalfa is a great crop, and Wesley will too. So, you know, this is something that is a really good forage option for haying. I would probably like to see it by itself instead of paired with grass. I think you will like the results and see that it's a little bit easier to manage if you put it just by itself instead of mix it with grass. And they do have Roundup Ready alfalfa now, so that's really helpful to us in keeping a clean, you know, weed-free stand as well. So just looking at alfalfa, again, just demonstrating here the importance of cutting our hay and harvesting it at the correct time. So you can see here, if we have good and fair quality alfalfa, you know, we still get some good gains and good intake. But if you're putting up alfalfa at the wrong time, so when it's too far into that flowering stage, we can actually even lose weight on alfalfa. So just another illustration of how important it is to make sure that you're harvesting the hay at the right stage of growth. So let's talk more about some legumes that we can put in. You know, clovers, I always tend to recommend those because there's something really easy to put in to really improve the quality of your cool season grass hay. There's 3 different options here: red clover, white clover, and lespedeza. So red clover is a great choice because it grows upright and it's a little taller, so it's much easier to catch in the mower whenever you're mowing there. So you're going to get a lot more of it in your hay, actually, just because of its growth habits. And it is going to improve the quality of our hay, and it does do a good job of mixing and persisting well. You know, it does have to reseed annually. So, you know, most of the time it'll probably reseed itself. You may find yourself every, you know, 3 years or so putting some more red clover seed back on, just to kind of help it persist and keep in the stand of your, let's say, fescue grass. And note here that if we are going to have legumes, we do need to soil test. We need to soil test no matter what, but if we expect our legumes to persist and do well in our cool season grass mixtures, then we need to make sure our phosphorus level is up. Really, typically, we like to see phosphorus soil levels at 30 pounds per acre to help those legumes go ahead and stay in that stand. White clover, this is another easy one that you can put into your cool season grass. Typically, I recommend this white clover if we're grazing. Just typically the primary use of the field is grazing. The only reason for that is it grows lower, so the cows' mouths are lower to the ground than what we would typically be doing in our hay. So we're going to catch more of that white clover in the cow's mouth than we would in the mower. So it's still a great choice, but I would typically just say red clover is what you should do in your hay fields just because of its more upright growth habit. Annual Espediza, this is a good one for some of those poor fertility soils that we might have. It does tolerate a low pH and drought. There are some different varieties that you can pick from with Annual Espediza. It does have to reseed itself, and so you may have to, every couple years again, kind of reseed it through your grasses, grass pastures or grass hay fields. It does not fix as much nitrogen as our red and white clovers do, but it's still a good choice to put in there. Now let's talk about warm season grasses. So, again, warm season grasses, they kind of give away what they are. They grow during the warm seasons, or during the warm months, of the year. So they're another great tool we can use. Oh, I'm seeing a question in the chat here, Patrick. I'll read it here. We understand that alfalfa can cause gas problems for cattle. When alfalfa is put up in hay, does it lose that component that causes the gas issues for the cows? Patrick, I'm going to let you answer that one.
Actually, Jill, let's put that one on hold for a second because I think Patrick had to step away for a minute.
Okay, all right. Well, I will, Patrick, I will have Patrick answer that when he comes back. He's a livestock specialist, so I'd rather him answer that one so I don't say anything incorrect there. Okay, back to warm season grasses. So these are not native warm season grasses here that I'm talking about. So Bermuda grass, it's a good one. You have to establish it by sprigs or seed. It grows back fast and it's going to give you a lot of forage. The drawback here is you do have to put a lot of nitrogen fertilizer on here. It takes a lot of nitrogen to produce it. So anyway, it's a good choice if you want to kind of diversify your forages and give your fescue pasture or fescue hay fields a rest and be able to harvest there in June and get actually good quality forage. And then as far as frequency of cutting, you can usually get 3 to 4 cuttings out of Bermuda grass if you start there in June. And research has shown that if you give it a little bit longer rest period, like a 28-day rest period versus a 21-day, you're going to see a lot more growth. And again, that just kind of relates back to that slide that I showed you with the grass growing, being able to grow faster, even if we leave it at a higher stubble height. So that's just giving it, an extra week of rest so it can keep growing back and persisting well in that pasture, in that hay field. Caucasian blue stem, it establishes quick and it's good on poor soils. And if you're going to put fertility on it, it'll also respond to that. If it's in a fescue field, you might consider it a weed. It might become invasive, but if you've got it by itself, there are some different varieties you have to choose from. I don't know a whole lot about blue stem. I don't know very many people that use it, but you know, it is another choice that you could have for a warm season. Crabgrass, here's another choice. Tim Schnockenberg, who'll be speaking to you, I believe, on Thursday, really loves crabgrass. Again, it's going to be a high quality summer annual forage that you can harvest in July and August. They've got some good varieties that you can choose from. I always hear Tim talk about Red River and Quick and Big. So those are something you can use. And then remember, you are going to have to reseed it annually just so it can keep up its persistence in that field as well. So let's talk about native warm season grasses for a little bit. So here's our different options of native warm season grasses. We have switchgrass, big blue, little blue, Indian grass, and eastern gamma grass. And as you can see, they grow really well in the summer, and they are drought tolerant, as you would imagine, since they are warm season grasses. So they're a great choice, but they do require a different management style. So let's talk about that just a little bit. So you know, there's been a lot more native warm season grass workshops here lately, and basically kind of what I have learned from those is they are a little bit harder to establish, but again, if you just keep your weeds under control, you're not going to have much of a problem. You just need to have a lot more patience with our native warm season grasses, because in the first year of growth, they probably don't look very good, but you really need to give it 2 years before you decide or make a judgment call on whether you like native warm season grasses or not, because really it takes about 2 years for them to really fill in the stand and look good and start growing. So they are something worth trying, and you've got to manage them differently. So with these grasses, our stubble height here is going to be anywhere from 6 to 10 inches. That's what we want to leave them with, because they have really deep roots, and if we start cutting those grasses off real short, they're really going to suffer when that hot, dry weather comes, if they have to slough off any of those long, deep growing roots. So you have to really remember, if you are going to have those in your as a forage, you need to be prepared and ready to harvest them at a higher cutting rate. And I see a question here in the chat. It says, how harmful is Johnson grass if mixed in the hay? That's a it depends question. Johnson grass is a noxious weed in Missouri, so we do need to control it, but it really depends. Tim Schnockenberg, who'll talk to you on Thursday night, he has a presentation called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly about Johnson grass, and honestly, the quality of Johnson grass is good. Some of the bad things about it is it can become a really invasive forage where we don't want it. And the bad thing is if we do get into a hot, dry situation and we hay that Johnson grass, if we put it in our hay and it's got high nitrate levels, dry haying or the dry baling process actually preserves the nitrate in the hay, and so we can still continue to see problems with our Johnson grass and with that nitrate even after dry baling. And I've got a few more slides on that at the very, very end, so you can kind of see a little bit that at the end. But basically, it depends. If it's not hot and dry and we don't have nitrate issues or concerns, it's probably going to be okay. The only problem is if there's any seed heads in there, anywhere you take that hay with Johnson grass in it, you can bet that pasture or that field next year is going to have Johnson grass starting right there where you fed hay.
Hey, Jill, you might make the point, though, that the prussic acid does this.
Yes. In a freeze situation where we would have like a late freeze, or we would have a drought and we have prussic acid, once the hay is cut, prussic acid dissipates immediately. but nitrate does not. And I know that's confusing to hear. And my last slide will have that written down, so you'll have that back to refer to whenever Patrick sends you those handouts. Okay, here's another really nice thing people like about the native warm season grasses. There at the bottom of this chart, you can see the removal rate of nutrients per pounds, or per ton, I'm sorry, of hay. And so, you know, that's pretty low. You know, the amount of nutrients that native warm season grasses take off when you hay them, when you compare it to something like fescue, you know, that's a drastic difference. And a lot of people, although the establishment cost is high for a native warm season grass, you can really save later on over time on your fertilizer bill. And I'm going to show a chart there showing prices of our native warm season grasses to establish here at the end of these slides. So this is Tim. This picture is Tim. And for those of you who don't know him, he is well over 6 foot tall. So you can see how tall Big Blue Stem can get. He really likes that grass. A lot of producers kind of tend to try out Big Blue Stem first. And it does have some good varieties. OZ70 seems to be the one that works really well around Southwest Missouri, and it has some good herbicide options of Plateau or Panoramic to help us control our weeds as well. So here's a case study that was done in Ozark County. A producer planted his Big Blue Stem in 2016. He got a cutting. You can see it there in 2017. And then in 2018, he got 5.3 tons per acre in 2 cuttings. And if you'll remember, that was the year we had really bad droughts. And we in Extension ended up having emergency drought meetings across the state because of how bad the drought was. So, you know, that's a pretty good amount of forage in the middle of a really terrible drought that we had in 2018. So you can see that, you know, native warm season grasses really live up to their name, that they are drought tolerant. They can still produce if managed well during those dry, hot seasons. Here's just our production comparison, just a chart here. I'm not really going to go over it more than to just say that basically we're going to use 3 times the amount of nitrogen fertilizer, cut or harvest two times as much in fescue hay to get about the same amount of forage as we would in 60 pounds of nitrogen in 1 to 2 cuttings with our native warm season. So that might turn you on to a native warm season grass as well, or at least considering it. So, and I know that we're going to try to have some native warm season grass workshops and field tours this year throughout Southwest Missouri, just kind of to introduce it and show how the producers in real life are using it and like it, and they can kind of share their struggles and the positives to native warm season grasses. So kind of just keep your eye out to that. I'm sure Tim will talk to you about it as well on Thursday night. And here's kind of the part that's the drawback. You do have to have your land out of production for a year, and it is kind of costly to put in, any of these warm season grasses. So they are a little bit expensive to put in there, but on some of them, but over time, the fertilizer savings might go ahead and pay out pretty quick, actually. I will note, I don't think I said this yet, Eastern Gamma Grass, that is a really good forage. The only reason you may not like it for hay, it is more of a clump growing forage, so it could get pretty bumpy at times on the balers. So that may be something that you want to consider as well as whenever you're thinking about native warm season grasses and what you want to turn into a hay field. Let's talk about summer annuals. We have sorghum Sudan, pearl millet, and teff. So Tef, it's kind of a newer grass. It's high quality. It's got fine leaves. It doesn't yield as high as other warm season grasses annuals. The one thing about Tef is that you're probably you will have to replant it every year if you want to kind of have a field of it, but definitely wouldn't have it for grazing. The root system is not very deep, and the way that livestock tend to eat, they'll just pull it up out of the ground, roots and all. So I would not recommend it for grazing, but for hay, I know some producers that used it and they really liked it. So it is a good choice. Sudan grass and pearl millet. These are some really good grasses to have if you want to harvest them in the summertime. They're drought tolerant. If you're going to convert your Kentucky 31 to a novel fescue and you don't want to put a crop in there, typically we recommend, I didn't touch on this, but I'll touch on it now. We recommend a spray smother spray where you spray your Kentucky 31 with Roundup, kill it. You plant a summer annual to smother any possible grasses that might come up, and then you have a final spray after you harvest that warm season annual to just make sure you've killed all possible Kentucky 31 and can start with a clean stand of novel fescue. So this is a good thing if you don't have crops or don't want to do crops, or the land you're putting in isn't conducive to crops. You can still have a sorghum Sudan or a pearl millet and get some haying or some grazing out of that pasture or that field for the summertime, and you don't really have to have it out of commission for an entire year if you're converting. You do have to watch it though. It grows quick, so this is kind of what our Sudan grass would look like when it's ready for haying or grazing. And this is some over mature Sudan grass, so you can see it grows really fast and really tall. And if you just look there, that's a bunch of stem material. And as I talked about earlier, that stem's going to have a lot of fiber in it. It's going to have lower digestibility, lower energy for our livestock. So we want to make sure that if we are utilizing sorghum Sudan or a pearl millet, that we cut it at the right time so that we're getting the best quality out of it. And then what Wesley and some others have asked me about here, nitrate poisoning. So probably in 2018, a lot of people, saw this in their pastures. Nitrate typically tends to accumulate in the lower stalk during periods of dry, hot weather. It may also occur in fields that have high nitrogen applications put on it. The important thing, again, to remember here is if you are dry baling your sorghum Sudan, pearl millet, or if you have Johnson grass as a weed in your cool season grass hayfield, if you have nitrate levels in there that are high and harmful to cattle, they will not dissipate. You're just preserving those nitrate levels when you're dry baling hay. And that is present in our sorghums, millets, and Johnson grass as well. And then the other one that Wesley asked me to touch on was prussic acid poisoning. This can occur during a late frost or even drought, and basically it's concentrated in the new growth in the plant. So and it's basically cyanide poisoning, but the way to avoid prussic acid poisoning as far as grazing goes is follow the rule of 2. You're going to wait 2 weeks after the last frost or after a drought-ending rain to let that new growth grow out, and the cyanide or the prussic acid poisoning kind of just grows out of the plant. Or you're going to go ahead and dry bale that hay. You can dry bale it because as soon as you cut it, that cyanide will escape and you won't have the prussic acid poisoning in your hay. And I will note, I didn't note earlier on nitrate poisoning, if you ensile your hay, so if you wrap it, you can over time see 20 to 50% reduction in the nitrate levels there. So that is an option if you did bale nitrate high forages to try to help dissipate that, is to wrap it. So that's all that I have. let me check the chat here. I don't think I see any questions currently, but feel free to type them in the chat as you think of them. I'll be on the rest of the evening.
Thanks, Jill. I don't see any other questions. I know that there was a question that came in about alfalfa and bloat, and I'll touch on that during my talk a little bit. That might Tim's a little bit more knowledgeable with alfalfa than I am. He talks on Thursday night. We might discuss that a little bit, but I think we've been on for almost a little over an hour. I think how about we take about 5 minutes and let people get a drink or something like that, and then I'll go ahead and start, and hopefully we'll get done pretty good time. Somebody gave me a thumbs up. So why don't we do that? Take about 5 minutes. We'll start back here about 7:15 then. Jill, are you on? Or Wesley?
I'm on.
Okay,
I'm on.
can you see my title slide?
Give me just a second here.
Yeah, I see it just fine, Patrick.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
For some reason, I was having some issues with getting the computer on the right screen. So I think we got that fixed. Okay, it's 7:15. I think we'll go ahead and start again if that's all right. Again, want to thank Jill for her talk there, and we're going to talk now. Hopefully we won't go much more than an hour here, but we're going to talk about cattle nutrition, feeding, and forage quality. And so some of the stuff Jill talked about earlier will kind of pop back up in my presentation. I know there was a question about alfalfa, and we'll try to touch on that a little bit during my talk as well. So I want to start, and basically one of the main things with cattle nutrition or cattle feeding is the important part. How do we feed a cow? And I just kind of simplified here, and this is kind of what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk we're going to talk some about nutrient requirements. We're going to talk about our resources that we have to feed cattle. And at the end, we're going to kind of put it all together, and we're going to talk a little bit about ration development. When I work with a producer, what we go through in putting rations together for cattle, and that kind of puts it all together. And so, but to simplify it, basically what we're doing daily is we're providing that animal the things that they need to meet their needs. And it's important to meet their needs. I've got a slide on that here later, but they've got a certain set of nutrient requirements, and they vary, and we'll talk about those variations throughout the night. We'll talk about what those needs are. And then we've got a set of resources, and this is a hay school, so we're going to talk some about hay and testing your forage. We're going to talk about that as well. I mean, you can test your hay. You've got pastures out that you graze. You can test those as well. Similar type of process, but you've got to know what your resources are. So testing your forage is very important, and we'll touch on that. And then also, I would suggest also on your supplements, testing them periodically as well, especially if you're feeding a lot of byproducts, because those can vary a lot from time to time. But even just grains can vary some as well. And so knowing what your resources are is important in meeting those cows' nutritional needs. And then basically we got to determine is our forage good enough? Is that satisfying our needs, or our cows' needs, or our calves' needs, or do we need to provide some supplementation? And so we'll talk a little bit about that at the end tonight. I'll talk about that as well. And so basically, and some of you may already do this on a regular basis, and that's good if you do, but if you don't, it's a good idea to test your hay. And these pictures here just kind of show pulling a hay sample. There's one hay probe there in the side of a round bale, and that's basically, you want on a round bale, you want to go on the round side there, where that kind of like the way that probe's set in there. If it's a square bale, the other picture here with square bales, basically putting that in the end of the bale on the lengthways side, and sampling that. And so when we talk about pulling a hay sample, probably the most important thing is to get a representative sample of what you're testing. So if it's representative, then it's going to be a good representation of that, and it'll be very useful in how we use that later when we put a ration together. And so that's very important, is getting a representative sample for accurate results. You want to sample about 10% of your hay resources, and when you send that in, so you're going to subsample a lot of bales, and then you're going to mix all that together, and then you're going to send in about 2 to 3 cups. And so the way I say it is, you got a 5-gallon bucket, you subsample 10% of your hay resources within that certain grouping of hay. You put that into a 5-gallon bucket, you mix it up real good, and then you take out a good grab sample that's going to be about 2 to 3 cups, put that in a Ziploc bag and send it off. Now we talk about representative, and you also kind of want to keep it when we talk about sample by groupings. And so like cutting date, harvest date, field, did it get rained on or not? Rain can affect that a little bit if it doesn't dry out very well, or that can affect the quality some. So those kind of things. Species of hay, I mean, you don't want to mix up, just go out. If you've got legume hays and grass hays, you want to keep them separate from the standpoint of sampling. Stored separately, comes out of a different field. I mean, and these are things like if you have specific questions on sampling and how you do that, contact one of us, either agronomy specialist, livestock specialist, and we can definitely help you with figuring that out. And you may need to take multiple samples throughout the year, and this is especially with silage. If you're feeding silage, it's one thing, because you can't. It's very hard to get one representative sample of that silage as it comes out of the bag or out of the pit, and so you may want to take multiple samples throughout the year as that silage changes. Or, and this we put a lot of hay in the barn, or we do from time to time. It's really hard to get a good representative sample of that hay if it's sitting in the barn. And so you may, as you feed that hay out, you may actually want to sample that periodically to see how your hay is changing. Or you may sample it before you put it in the barn, but a lot of times it doesn't work as good that way. And when we talk about sampling, we really want to sample it at right about the time when we're getting ready to feed it, because there is going to be some change and some variation. And so sampling it before it goes into the barn, there may be some change or variation that happens while it's sitting in the barn. And so it's better to sample that hay closer to the time when you get ready to feed it, and then, because that's going to be more accurate on what it's actually going to, nutritional value it's actually being, the animal's going to be able to consume. We talk about forms and filling those out. Obviously, if you have any questions related to that, contact one of us, livestock specialist, agronomy specialist, and we can work with you on that. One thing I know is if you provide an email on that form, you're probably going to get those results back a little bit faster. And a lot of times we work with a lab here in Southwest Missouri, Custom Labs out of Monette, a lot of times. And basically you want to get that hay sample in early in the week. And if you get it in early in the week, usually by the end of the week, you'll get those results back. But if you get it in late in the week, it may be a while before you get the results back. And so that's one thing to keep in mind, is to try to get those early in the week, because then they analyze it and you get results back pretty quickly. But if it goes in late in the week, if the sample goes in late in the week, it might be a while. It may have to sit there for a while, and that might actually affect the sample a little bit, especially if you've got silage or baleage. Those samples, if you're close to the lab and you can just hand deliver those, it'd probably be better. But if you have to ship them, definitely check with your lab that you're shipping them to, and make sure you package those correctly, so that when they get there, they're in good shape for them. A lot of times you're going to have to keep them frozen or cool, in order to, because if those samples heat up, you're going to get spoilage and you're going to get damage to the sample, and that's going to cause inaccurate numbers. And so that's just something to keep in mind with silage or baleage as well. So when we obviously, if you have any questions or anything, just type those in the chat, and we'll get those answered. Kind of move through this maybe a little fast, but if you have any questions, please stop me and we'll get those answered. When we look at a forage test analysis, and I'll actually slip to the second slide here. We look at a forage test analysis. Basically, you're going to see two columns, and you can see that here in this slide right here. You've got an as fed or an as is column, and you got a dry column. And I'll back up here. And so basically, those two columns, your as fed or your as is column, is basically going to be the wet numbers, as we call it. And then you have the dry column, or the dry numbers, and the dry numbers are the numbers that we actually use in the analysis when I'm putting a ration together, when I'm working with a producer on a ration. The dry numbers are what I use because there's no water in there, and so everything's consistent at that point. With dry numbers, you can compare everything on an equal basis. What we will then do is, so as you see here, it's 100% dry matter, so that means there's no water. And so basically, you can compare everything, different hays, different silage versus dry, wet versus dry, whatever. On those dry numbers, you can compare everything together because there's no water there. Your dry numbers will always be higher than your wet numbers on different nutrients, and that's because the water's been taken out, because the water dilutes the numbers. And so when I'm comparing feedstuffs, when I'm developing a ration, as I said, I always use the dry numbers for protein, energy, those kind of things, and we'll go through those here in a little bit as we go through the night and kind of talk about what we're utilizing there. But then when I'm done with the ration and I've got it on a dry basis, what I'm going to feed that animal, then I actually go back and this will make more sense at the end when I put a ration together or when I go through putting a ration together, but I'll go back and I'll add back the water, as I call it, or I'll basically divide the amounts by the dry matter percentage, which is there in the as fed number, there as is column there. This one, it's 89% dry matter. I'll divide that by that. The other thing I'll also account for is wastage, and I'll talk about that later. But this sheet just kind of goes through everything that and I'll go through these in a little more depth here in the next few slides. As far as we look, moisture is very important to understand. And then nitrates, we touched a little on that. This sample is actually I think it's an alfalfa orchard grass sample, so we shouldn't have a nitrate issue with it. But it does say it's negative. And then RFV, I won't talk much about that tonight, but basically that's an analysis, or that's a index, and they use that a lot when we're buying and selling hay, when we're pricing hay, especially with our alfalfa. But it's really just it's a number that you can use to compare different hay lots. But I don't utilize that a lot when we're putting a ration together. And so from a nutritional standpoint, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that tonight. And then protein, fiber, energy, those are very important, and we'll go through those a little bit later as far as putting a ration together. Nitrogen, basically nitrogen times 6.25 equals crude protein. And so if you take that nitrogen number and you multiply that times 6.25, that'll give you your crude protein there at the top. And then minerals, we'll talk a little bit about those. I don't, when I'm putting a ration together, I don't spend a whole lot of time with those, but typically when we look at minerals from a feeding standpoint, I would just suggest you work with a local feed dealer and provide a proper mineral at free choice, trace mineral vitamin supplement, free choice, to meet the needs of what you're feeding. So when we look at info, what you need from the forage test, dry matter is very important because we're going to utilize that from a ration development standpoint. Energy, there were a lot of different energy numbers there, and I'll go into those a little more depth. But the one that we're going to utilize a lot when we're putting a ration together, when we're determining if the forage is meeting the animal's needs, is total digestible nutrients. And we utilize as energy. It takes into account more than energy, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. Crude proteins, what we use from a protein standpoint. And then, as I mentioned a little bit, mineral, vitamins, trace minerals. Calcium and phosphorus are important, and we want to see a 2-to-1 ratio on those, and then I'll also talk about grass tetany a little bit later as well. And then fibers, and Jill touched on this a little bit in the slide that she had. Our fibers are very important, and the two fibers that we look at in the forage test are neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber. And what I'm talking about here is cell wall, forage cell wall. And there's 3 components of the cell wall that we measure: hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. And hemicellulose digests pretty rapidly, or can digest. I guess there's a lot of variability to digestion on these. Hemicellulose is probably the most digestible of the 3. Cellulose digests some, and lignin's nearly indigestible. And basically, when we look at analysis, there's an analysis that's done. It's similar to what the rumen would actually do, where we go through a digestion analysis and we digest these fibers, and similar to what the rumen would do, but they do it in a lab. And in the first analysis, where we're digesting in the neutral detergent fiber analysis, what you're digesting is really the hemicellulose. When we get that analysis back, the residue that's actually left over from that analysis we calculate that as a percentage, and that percentage is a good predictor of intake. And so basically what the rumen would do from that standpoint is it would digest the hemicellulose, and certain forages that are higher in NDF or neutral detergent fiber, there's going to be more residue left over in the rumen. And so from that standpoint, that animal can't eat as much as that forage versus a forage that's lower in NDF. And we'll look at some differences in that here in a little bit. Now, acid detergent fibers, as it says, an acid analysis or an acid digestion. And in this digestion, as I said, lignin's nearly indigestible. So cellulose would be the one that would be digested in this analysis. And so just like the rumen would do it, it would digest the cellulose, and the residue that's actually left over, we would calculate that as a percentage. And the more of that residue that's left over, that's a measurement of digestibility. And so basically, when you get down here at the bottom of this slide, it says lower NDF, lower ADF means less of these fiber residues is left over. That means more, that animal can consume more of that forage, because we don't have as much of that forage left over filling up the rumen. And they also get more out of that forage because there's less of it left over from that standpoint. So it's more digestible, so they can eat more and they can utilize more if those numbers are those percentages of NDF and ADF from those analyses are lower. And so as we talk about that, forage maturity, and Jill touched a little bit on this, impacts forage quality. And so from an ADF and an NDF standpoint, if our forage is more mature, as you see there, the percentage of ADF and NDF increase. The reason it increases is there's more of that stem, there's more of that cell wall matter. There's more of those things there because there's more stem. So basically, as forage maturity increases, there's more stem, less leaf. There's more stem and less leaf. There's more of those fibers. There's more of those fibers. They don't eat as much and they don't digest as much, and they don't utilize as much. And so that affects animal production. And you can see over here, percent of leaves decrease, percent of protein decreases. That's because there's more stem and less leaf, basically. And we'll see that here a little bit later when we look at different forages and how those fibers are different in those forages. But one statement that's very important down here is a lot of people like to push yield, and pushing yield's all right, but increasing yield does not necessarily increase the amount of available nutrients being harvested. What I mean by that is if you let that forage sit in the field longer to get more tonnage, but it's more mature because of that, you probably aren't getting any more available nutrients for that animal. And so that's just something to think about from a harvest standpoint. And this is maturity influences quality, and this is on alfalfa. But basically, as it gets more mature, as we've said, less or more NDF, and actually in here more less total digestible nutrients and less protein, and that goes back to what we had said there in that last slide. And then you kind of look at it here from the standpoint of performance. And Jill showed a slide on this with fescue. This is with alfalfa and stages of maturity, but on yearling steers. But basically, what's showing here is that as that alfalfa gets more mature, the animals don't perform as well, and it takes a lot more feed to meet that gain that they're looking for. And so this is actually, here's a set of slides that will go through related to cows and feeding cows. And this was given to me by Gene Schmitz, who's a state regional livestock, or as a regional livestock field specialist up in the Pettis County area, up in the Sedalia area. And he kind of put this together. And this is kind of to compare two times of the year when you would harvest this hay, and when you should harvest it probably more in May, and when a lot of people typically harvest it more in July. And when you look at there, obviously you can see the nutritional differences with which we would expect. You have a higher quality hay in May versus July, because you've got more protein and you got less fiber and you got more total digestible nutrients, and you've got more net energy and maintenance, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But that's an actual energy value that, and so we'll touch on that a little bit later. But when you look at the May versus July, you see those differences, and when you take that into how we actually feed the cow, and so these would be mid-gestation cows, and we're trying to basically on a body condition score 5 cow, we're just maintaining her. On these body condition score 4 cows, we're trying to work the condition back up to that body condition score 5 or possibly a 6 before the next calving season. And so when you look at the May hay here, you don't really need a whole lot of, I mean, if you're pushing a lot more body condition, trying to put a little more body condition on that cow a little quicker, you may need to supplement, and DDGs is a good energy plus protein supplement. You may need to push a little bit more. It also talks about, and we'll talk about body condition a little bit later, but it's also a good reminder about body condition score and energy status. And if we work to keep those animals in good body condition score and energy status, then we may not need to provide as much supplementation to work those cows back to the proper condition for the next calving season as well. That's just kind of a little sidebar on this slide. But then you look at the July hay, and so obviously the July hay was poorer quality hay, and you look here, especially if those cows are in lower condition, and we've got to work those cows back up to that proper condition before the next calving season. You can see there, with this lower quality hay, we've got to provide more supplementation and considerably more supplementation, depending on how much we're needing to push body condition score. And then this is mid and late gestation. And so the other thing that happens when we go from mid gestation to late gestation is energy needs for that cow increase, because we're getting her ready for the next calving season. She's also fetal development and those kind of things are taking place, and so her energy needs go up. And you can see there that on that May hay, we don't need to provide hardly any supplementation from an energy or a protein standpoint. But when you look at that July hay, we're going to have to provide a little bit of supplementation, and this is just to maintain that cow in that body condition score 5. So, and this is just another slide to kind of, this actually talks about different species effects on forage quality. And so we mentioned a little bit earlier that higher NDF, lower protein, and part of that was because of, and so the thing about it is when you look at alfalfa and red clover versus your cool season grass hays, the difference here in your legumes versus your grasses is your legumes typically have more leaf and less stem. And when they have more leaf and less stem, basically what that means is, what that shows is, and you can see from this picture here, is your neutral detergent fiber, or those fibers, and ADF would be the same thing, or acid detergent fiber. Those fibers are going to be lower, and the protein over here, you look on the other side, because there's more leaf and less stem, you have higher protein as well. And so that's, now there's some variation here in the energy a little bit, but not a lot. Typically what you're, the main differences when we look at species and forage quality here is the fact that those legumes have more leaf and less stem, and therefore they have lower fiber levels and higher protein levels. So we went through all of that, and now we're going to start talking, probably focusing a little bit more on nutrient needs and those kind of things. But why is it important to meet nutrient requirements? And basically, if we don't, and that kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier, she has a need, and if we don't meet that need, she doesn't perform properly. That cow doesn't perform properly, or that calf doesn't perform properly. And as you can see here on this slide, basically, if we don't meet that cow's need, she doesn't do what she's supposed to for us. She doesn't raise the calf properly. If we're restricting, or if we're not meeting her needs in late gestation like we should, it could lead to some calving issues. Could lead to her not breeding back, and then we've especially, we'll talk about first calf heifers or cows here in a few slides. We'll focus a little more on that, but those cows are very important to our herd, because we've spent a lot of time and effort and money developing those females, and if she doesn't breed back after her first calf, we've lost a lot of time and effort and money in that female, because we've got to get rid of her and put another one in. And so, but if we don't provide proper nutrition to those cattle, reproduction suffers usually. And then the research in this area is been there for a while, but late gestation nutrition and how that affects the calf of that cow's calf. And we've seen a lot of research. A lot of this research was in the Nebraska area on stocks or native range that's deficient in protein and low in energy and those kind of things, and looking at supplementation or not supplementing those cows in an environment that is low in nutrition in late gestation. And they showed a lot of effects to calf performance, growth, heifer reproduction, carcass quality, those kind of things of the calves out of those cows that were restricted in nutrition in late gestation. And so, and there's even older research in that as well in those areas. And then the other thing is, if we're not meeting those, and I'm not going to talk a lot about health status tonight, but if we're not meeting those nutritional needs, sometimes that affects the health status of our animals. And even though we provide vaccinations and those kind of things to help boost that immunity in those females or in those animals in our herd, if we don't have proper nutrition being provided to those animals, that can cause those vaccinations to not work as well, and that can affect the health status in those animals. And so nutrition is very important to the performance of our cattle operation and the cattle within our operation. So a couple of visual indicators that we'll touch on more later as we talk about them, but body condition score, I've kind of hit a little on this earlier, but is a very good indicator of energy status, and we'll touch on that more as far as indicators of other things in the cattle operation. And then manure score is a very good indicator of protein issues. but also just forage digestion in general, or digestion of the diet in general. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So when we look at nutrient needs, the kind of break them down in these categories, and really the most important one is water. We don't talk a whole lot about water, but it is the most important one, because if they don't have proper good water sources and good water consumption, that's going to affect the ability for them to consume the rest of the nutrients here. We spend a lot of time with energy and protein. They're probably the main nutrients that we spend a lot of time with. And then vitamins and minerals are important, but in a much smaller amount. And so we'll talk about these in some depth as we go through the next few slides. Water, it's just kind of a slide here basically 1 gallon per 100 pounds of body weight's kind of what you're looking at. Obviously, if it's warmer, they're going to need more water, and milk contains a lot of water in it. And so if they're lactating, they're going to need more water as well. And so, and we talk about intake here is influenced by, this is going to be a theme on the rest of the nutrients when we talk about them. Intake of those nutrients is going to be influenced by body size and then temperature. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the other nutrients as well. And then lactation, and as we said, milk contains a lot of water. And so if they're lactating, then they're going to need more water. And so, and that's the same with other nutrients as well. So energy and kind of energy and protein kind of go hand in hand. When we look at sources of energy, we're talking about hay tonight. And so, a lot of our hays, that's going to be a major source of our forage in general is going to be a major source of energy to our cattle operation or our cattle. And a lot of times our forages, when we look at energy in comparison to what we can supplement, our forages are typically low in energy and high in fiber. And so in some instances, our forages don't provide quite enough energy to meet that animal's needs. And so we need something that's high in energy and low in fiber. And so that's where the grains, the concentrates, and the byproducts come in. And we'll kind of show that later when we look at ration development. Fats and oils, we don't really utilize a lot of those, other than I'll get to body condition here in a bit, but they're much more energy dense, but we don't typically added oils for other than our oil seeds. Any added oils, we don't typically put those in the ration, other than just a little bit for dust control and palatability. And so, but probably one of the most important energy sources that cow has is body condition. And certain times of the production cycle, typically early lactation and during lactation, sometimes she's not going to be able to consume as much energy as she needs to meet her energy needs. And so she's going to have to pull that energy from somewhere. And that typically comes from body condition. And if she doesn't have the body condition to do it, then milk production and performance and reproduction and those other things are going to suffer. And so that's a very important indicator of energy status, as we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's a very important way to satisfy her energy needs. And that's why it's important to hit your body condition score targets prior to calving and at breeding. And then when we're ready, if that body condition score drops a lot and that calf's big enough to wean, then work on weaning that calf as well. And then from that standpoint, also, if that cow doesn't maintain body condition as like she should in your operation, or stay in the proper ranges, and she's probably a female that needs to find another home. So, and if it's just one, maybe that. If it's a lot of your herd, then maybe we need to look at adjusting the nutrition to the herd somehow, adjusting herd in some ways. So, when we look at energy measurements, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, but total digestible nutrients, it's a very simple number, and that's why we kind of utilize it within as an energy value. As I said earlier, it's not just energy. It takes into account protein as well. Takes into account protein as well. And so, but it is a good representation of energy. And so that's why we utilize it. It's simple. And when I work with producers on rations and putting diets together, that it works. If you want to look at a more stricter energy measurement, net energy, which is the actual amount of energy that feedstuff provides to that animal. They're basically, if you break that down, you've got energy, net energy, and maintenance, and that's the amount of energy that's required to maintain that animal with no performance. And then after that, you have net energy of gain, which is so if you and this would be more in your growing cattle. This would be more in your growing cattle. If you you would have net energy and maintenance, and then you would add energy on from a gain standpoint. And when we like, if you look back at that forage analysis, when we analyze that, it gives you all of those numbers. And so that's that is the numbers there. And then net energy of lactation. Now, that's more of a number that's used in the dairy industry, not necessarily in the beef cattle industry. A lot of our numbers other than net energy and maintenance in the beef cattle industry are rolled into net energy and maintenance for cows, like lactation and some of those other numbers. And so, but for what I work with, when I work with producers, I usually use total digestible nutrients because it's a simple number and it works pretty well. So when we look at factors that actually influence energy requirements, body size, as I said, that bigger cows need more energy. Smaller cows don't need as much. Gain, if we want more performance out of those animals, we need to provide more energy. Growing versus mature first calf cows. So your first calf cow has a very high energy need. And we'll talk about body condition here in the next few slides, but it's very important to watch this cow very closely. And I'd almost suggest feeding your first calf cows, basically once that female calves, basically feeding her separate from the mature herd, if possible, until their second calf. The reasoning behind that is they're smaller than your mature cows typically. They don't eat quite as much as your mature cows. And so kind of from a sorting standpoint there, and with them being smaller, they need a higher, because they have a very high energy need. They need a higher plane of nutrition than your mature cows to meet that energy need versus your mature cows. And with your mature cows and being bigger, they're going to push those cows away, and you're going to have issues there as well. But that's because basically after they calve for the first time, they're going to be lactating. They're going to have a high energy need there. They're also going to be repairing that reproductive tract for the first time. They're going to be trying to, and they're still growing, and they're going to be trying to get rebred and all those things. And like I said, we put a lot of time and effort into those cows, and if we don't get them rebred, they fall out of the herd. We've lost a lot of time, effort, and money in those females. And so that's my suggestion if possible. We look at stage of production, dry versus lactating. Basically, a lot of times there's about a 50% difference. When you take that cow, when she's lactating till you dry her off, you can reduce her net energy or her maintenance requirements, or reduce her requirements by about 50%. And so there's a big difference there because of milk production. And then amount of milk production. If we've got cows that are higher producing cows, they're going to need more energy. Gender bulls are a little bit different than steers and heifers from that standpoint, from an energy standpoint. Environment, we're a little over a month from when we had our nice winter storm here in the Midwest, especially in Missouri, and there for about 2 weeks. If you probably noticed that your cows were consuming a lot more hay, and the thing about it is when it's really cold like that, if you don't provide extra nutrition to those cows, they're going to meet that need in one way or another. And if you don't provide extra nutrition to them, they're going to meet that need with that body condition on their back, and to the point where if they can't do that, then they're going to stop performance. And so the other end of that spectrum, so when it's cold, we can feed more to that female or that calf to meet that energy need that we need for that proper performance. When it's hot, it's a lot harder to do that because they won't eat anymore. So what ends up happening is they've got, and they require more energy to dissipate heat. And so what ends up happening is instead of that energy going to performance, it goes to dissipating that heat. And so because we can't feed them anymore to meet that energy need, because they just won't eat anymore. So that's one thing with heat stress and why we need to help remedy heat stress. And we're in the fescue country. And so we see a lot of that in the summertime. And so we've got to do our best to dissipate that heat stress, because that's going to affect our performance, because they've got to utilize that energy to dissipate heat and not to perform. So, and then genetics, not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but basically breeds that have been bred for bigger body size and more milk production are going to have a higher nutrient need or energy need versus those that have not. We've also looked at individually feed efficiency and kind of see some differences there where we look at animals on an individual basis, and we can identify animals that eat more but get the same performance as other animals, and on the other end of that spectrum, animals that basically perform that gain the same but don't eat quite as much. And so residual feed intake and residual gain are some of those things where we've looked at animals on an individual basis, and you'll see that sometimes if you're buying bulls especially, you'll see some of that as well. So body conditions score, I've touched on it a little bit. We're going to dive into it a little bit more here. As I said, it's pretty much a good indicator of energy status in the animal. 1 to 9 scale, 1's emaciated, 9's obese. We like to be somewhere in the middle, and we'll kind of touch on that here as far as a middle range. You're looking at when you're evaluating this in the animals, you're looking at the back, you're looking at the brisket, you're looking at the kind of the rib area there, hooks, pins, flank region there, and you're just evaluating condition. And basically, it takes about, each condition roughly is about 75 to 100 pounds. And so, as we'll show here in a little bit, kind of our optimum conditions based on the production cycle. One of the things, and we could spend a lot more time on this, but for time's sake, I just wanted to kind of mention a couple of things here with body condition. And basically, the main thing is it's very much linked to energy status and energy requirements, and are they being met? And we talk about putting rations together, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but you can do it right on paper, but one of the ways to know if it's actually working in the animal is to see how the animal is performing based on it. And one of the ways that we can see is the energy status and the body condition, and is the are they in proper body condition, or do we need to adjust something to better meet that body condition? And so that's body condition is a good way to see if that energy status is being met. Reproduction, obviously, and if we're in that 5 to 6 range at breeding, or actually 5 at breeding, that's for optimum. That's when you'll see optimum reproduction. If we're below that, then that reproduction is going to suffer. Same way with colostrum development and health of the calf. Colostrum is very important for calf performance. And if she comes into calving in a poor body condition below a 5, that can affect our colostrum development. And then just profit potential of the cow herd, because if we're maintaining those cows in proper condition, those cows are breeding back, those cows are producing for us. And so in a timely manner, where they're having a calf, roughly 1 calf a year, then that's good for our profit potential in our cow herd. So, and the optimum range of scores is a 6 to a 4, and we'll kind of go through that. And you can see this cow here, she's a 6. And as you can see there, pretty good flesh over her backbone, top line, tail, head, brisket, through the flank region there, through the ribs. You don't see a whole lot of bone. It's just pretty much, she's pretty well covered. And on replacement heifers, first calf heifers, they really need to be in this condition score at calving, because they're likely going to lose a little more condition from calving to breeding, because they just can't eat enough to meet those needs, all those needs I was talking about earlier. And so they really do. Now, your mature cows, they're not going to lose as much, and so somewhere in that 5 to 6 range is probably fine on them. But I would say with your replacement heifers, they really need to be in that 6 range. And then here's a 5, and as you notice here with this female, you see a little bit more bone, a little more tail, or you see a little more bone, not as much flesh there over that tail head. You see a little bit more bone, rib there. Not as much fat in that brisket region there, and so you can kind of see there a little more ribs visible and things like that. Now, this is what we want her at breeding, because research has shown this is kind of optimum condition at breeding time, for optimum condition for optimum pregnancy rates at breeding time. And then we have the body condition score 4. And basically, what I was talking about earlier, I said, if our cows are getting to this condition score, we really need to, if those calves are heavy enough to wean, we probably need to go ahead and wean them. As you can see here, a lot more bone showing, a lot more rib showing, hardly any fat in that brisket area or in the flank region, there's just a lot more bone work showing there. And the thing about it is I mentioned earlier about 75 to 100 pounds per condition score. If we get down to this 4 range, we can pull that calf off, separate the cow and the calf, and that cow should. We can work on that cow and prior to the next calving season, we've got plenty of time to put that weight back on her and that condition back on her. If we get much below this, we're having to put a lot more weight back on, and that may not be as good. So that's why I say kind of stay in this range. The other thing about it is you think about at a body condition score 4, what quality of milk is that cow providing that calf, and how much is she providing? And the thing about it is some people say, well, let's creek feed. Well, that's probably not going to work very well to get the condition back on that cow. Really the best way to do it, and you can do it more efficiently, is to separate the calf and the cow, feed the calf, provide them better nutrition, and they're going to perform better, provide that cow better nutrition, and she's going to perform better. But leaving them together, that's just not going to work out very well, and trying to work that cow back up. The other thing to think about with cows like this, if they're always kind of finding their way down to that body condition score 4 or lower and not bouncing back very well or not maintaining very well, then those are probably cows that we need to consider culling or finding a new home for, because they just don't fit in the operation very well. So I'll kind of stop here for a second. Any questions so far?
No questions. No questions in the chat right now, Patrick.
Okay. So I'm going to move on and talk about protein, and a lot of the requirements vary by a lot of the same stuff that we talked about with energy. Crude proteins are our main measurement here. One of the things that's very important with protein is the rumen bacteria. And so our rumen's very important because that rumen takes that forage and converts it into a usable product for that animal to utilize to meet their nutritional needs. And the rumen bacteria are very important to that process. And if we don't properly feed those rumen bacteria, we don't get proper fiber digestion, we don't get proper intake, because as I said earlier, if we have more of that fiber residue left over, we don't get as much out of that forage, and those cows can't eat as much. And you can see here, protein's very important to feed those rumen bacteria. And so this was given to me by our state beef cow nutrition extension specialist. This slide and talks about crude protein as it affects intake and influences fiber digestion and intake. And as you can see there, the more protein we provide, the better the intake will be. Now, protein's typically not a big problem in Missouri. You get to the west, we start seeing some issues where they're grazing some dormant native range pastures, or they're grazing a lot of warm seasons, and maybe in the late part of the grazing period, or in the time when it could be an issue in this part of the country is if our fescue got away from us and we've got over mature grass. But like I said, protein's typically not our biggest problem in Missouri because of our cool season grasses or our legumes, our mixed pastures. Usually can provide a lot of protein for us, but we might need a supplement, as you see there at the bottom, some of those times when we may not have enough protein and intake. And as I'll show here in a little bit, manure score. Manure score is kind of an indicator of forage digestion, and protein, as we said, is pretty linked to that. Two proteins types that we work with. A lot of our protein, a lot of our supplements, if we supplement, and a lot of times we'll supplement energy, or we'll supplement a product that's high in energy as well as protein. And on those natural sources of protein, which is I've got listed there, distillers grains, corn gluten feed, soybean meal, brewers grains, those are a combination of two types. A natural source is a combination of two types of protein. You have the protein that's digested in the rumen, or the digestible protein, and then you have the protein that bypasses the rumen and is digested in the lower GI tract. And so basically your digested protein in the rumen, what happens is that's converted to microbial protein in the rumen, and then goes to the lower GI tract and is digested just like the bypass protein is. And so when we look at natural sources, they supply, and those are our byproducts. They also our pastures, our legume hays, alfalfa, clover, lespedeza, other hays like that are pretty good protein sources as well. They're going to supply nitrogen to the rumen microbes or rumen bacteria to make microbial protein, and they're also going to supply protein to the animal. in both forms, basically. Now, the other source, and we don't feed a lot of this, but they do sometimes in feedlots, but not in our typical cow-calf operations, or we don't feed a lot of non-protein nitrogen unless we're feeding protein tubs, which non-protein nitrogen does make up a lot, can make up a portion of the protein in the protein tubs, is non-protein nitrogen. And this is a protein source that's totally digestible. Urea and biuret are the two types that we typically see, and basically this is strict nitrogen that goes into the rumen. Rumen microbes convert that to microbial protein. So those are the two types of proteins. Like I said, a lot of times we're going to be feeding in our cow-calf operations, or even in our soccer operations, we're going to probably be feeding natural sources of protein. And so,
Patrick,
yes,
I missed a question in the chat. We had a question: what would you say is heavy enough to wean? And then there was a comment that someone had bought weaned calves at 230 pounds. So they're just wondering what's heavy enough to wean a calf.
That kind of depends. I think we look at it more on age. And I know I said that heavy enough to wean. Probably, I think 250 is a little light myself. But I probably would go in that 4 range or above. Some age is going to play a little bit of part in that. I know we talk a lot about age, and we can wean as young as 100 days, but in drought stress, or in drought situations where we need to wean, but I would, and part of that's going to be that point with that cow. Her calf, if she's not performing very well and not maintaining condition well, it might be that her calf's not doing that well either. Now, it could be the other way around as well. Or I mean, the calf could be doing really well, and she's putting a lot of nutrition into that calf. And so I guess I'd probably somewhere in that 4 range would be kind of where I would say. I don't know, Wesley's on. He probably has a little more experience in that type of situation than I do. But I would say any other comments on that. But I think somewhere in that 350 to 4 range probably is. That might be. You might also, if you're seeing that calf grazing a lot and stuff like that, that's another thing. That rumen's pretty functional. Probably would be fine. So sorry, that's probably not a better answer to that question. But anything else?
No more questions in the chat at this time.
So this is just kind of, this is what I talk about with manure scoring, and basically this is a good indicator, as I said, about digestion of the ration, and it's a pretty good indicator if we're deficient in protein as well. 1 to 5 scale, you see there on the far end's a 2, and it's pretty loose, and then you see on the other far end and it's 5, and it's pretty hard and dark and stacking, and the thing is where you really want to be is kind of right there in the middle, about a 3, because what can happen sometimes if you're all the way over on the far end by a 2, yeah, that's pretty digestible stuff, but sometimes you may not be getting all you can get out of that forage if it's that digestible. obviously on the other end, on the 5, we know we're not getting all we can get out of it. And so we need to do something to, and that's where we can add a little bit of protein. We're probably seeing some low intake as well on that, because basically that forage is not being digested as that's a low quality forage. It's not being digested as well. And so they're not eating as much, they're not getting as much out of it. And so if we provide a little protein there, we can improve that digestion a little bit. And that's kind of the thing there. We kind of want to be in the middle there, because that's a pretty good representation of getting proper digestion as well as proper passage rate. So we look at minerals, and minerals are a very small portion of the diet, but they are important for various things, and bone, muscle, organ, cell, enzyme structure, and production. Mineral deficiency can lead to poor performance and health issues. What I will say, though, is we talked about energy and protein. If your energy and your protein are not right, you're not going to fix the problem by feeding this fancy mineral. And hopefully, if you get what I mean there, basically make sure your energy and your protein is right. And then basically your mineral might bump your performance a little bit, but if your energy and your protein's not right, your performance is not going to be good. And feeding a really fancy mineral to try to improve that performance isn't going to fix that issue. And we're not in Missouri, we're not in the part of the country where we see a lot of true soil mineral deficiencies. You might see a little benefit, and we'll talk about vitamins here in a little bit. You might see a little benefit with some, and there's some main mineral issues there, and we'll talk about calcium phosphorus ratio and grass tetany. Those are probably the main ones that we deal with in this part of the country, because of various things that are taking place. But basically, like I said earlier, providing a free choice mineral, trace mineral vitamin mix, free choice, working with a feed dealer, and identifying one that fits what you're feeding is a good place to be from a mineral and vitamin and trace mineral supplementation standpoint. Like I said, there's really two main things that we probably have issues with in this part of the country. And calcium to phosphorus ratio is really not an issue unless you're supplementing a lot. And the reasoning there is our grains and our byproducts are low in calcium, high in phosphorus. And so if we're providing a lot of supplementation, sometimes we can get that calcium to phosphorus ratio out of whack a little bit. And so adding a little bit of limestone, which is cheap, can fix that problem. And just throw this in here: if you're feeding 3 pounds of distillers, that's equal to about 4 ounces of 10% phosphorus mineral. And so that's typically what we would talk about consumption on a mineral. And so when you're feeding a lot of those byproducts that are high in phosphorus, you probably need to add a little bit of calcium to balance that out. Now, grass tetany.
Patrick?
Yes.
There's a question in the chat referring to mineral. It said, how much better is a loose mineral than a block mineral?
I will talk about that. I think it's personal preference. I think probably your loose mineral intake's very important on these minerals, and especially if you've got something mixed in the mineral. I wonder sometimes if in our block minerals, if we're getting adequate intake. Your loose mineral, you might get better intake. Now, I've heard of some people lately, their cattle are consuming a lot of mineral, and in that case, we need to add a little more salt. But I would probably, and some of it also depends on how you're feeding it too, I know, because obviously the block minerals are going to be more hardier in certain conditions versus the loose mineral. But I think from that standpoint, your intake's probably going to be a little bit better with the loose versus the block. But I mean, if you notice your cattle are having some issues with intake on the block, you might switch to the loose or from that standpoint. But I think it just comes down to consumption, and sometimes with those blocks, you may not get as good a consumption with the loose. But so, anything else?
No further questions.
Okay, thank you. So grass tetany, and it's due to low magnesium levels in the blood. The cattle that are typically gonna have this problem are older cows, older lactating cows, and early lactating cows, because basically we talk about milk production, we're putting a lot of minerals into that milk, a lot of magnesium into that milk. They've got to mobilize that magnesium from their bones. Older lactating cows don't, or older cows don't do as good a job of that as younger cows. And so when that happens and they're grazing that really lush green grass that is causing the problem, you're having low magnesium uptake from it, that can lead to this problem. And a lot of times the first symptom we see if we've got this problem is death. And so the best way to deal with the problem is to prevent it. But the other symptoms are staggers, convulsions, and coma. And so the main way I work with producers on this is prevention, because as I said, a lot of times the first symptom we see is death. So the main thing here we look at prevention is, and if you look at the literature and research in this area and some of the literature in this area, we talk a lot about a high mag mineral, and that's good to provide, but salt is also involved in the process of the uptake of the magnesium. And so if you're not providing adequate salt, you might also be causing this magnesium deficiency as well. And so basically what I would suggest is, like I said before, having a good mineral out there for them that has plenty of salt in it, magnesium, and the other things that they need as well. But having this out there about 30 days prior to green up and while the grass is lush, and I would say year round you need to have a good mineral out as well. And then another way to help in prevention of this is those higher risk animals, don't graze them on those green lush pastures, which it's kind of hard to do, but graze those high risk pastures with steers, heifers, or dry cows that are less susceptible to the issues, or to having the low magnesium levels. And then adequately providing fertility on those pastures is another thing as well. Nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, because nitrogen and potassium, high levels of that can tie up the magnesium uptake to the animal. And so adequate fertilization from that standpoint. Trace minerals, selenium, zinc, manganese, copper, cobalt. These help with reproduction, immune system, and performance. And main thing on these is use organic sources, because they're going to be more bioavailable and they're available. And if you're going to put them in there, you want to make sure they're bioavailable to the animal. Vitamins, A, D, and E are the ones that we typically worry about. If the animals are outside, grass is green and lush, typically our A, D, and E are met. Typically the time when we're going to need to supplement these is going to be when we're supplementing those dormant forages or those poor quality forages, or if the animals are inside. But those are the ones we typically worry about, AD&E. The rest are usually met either through rumen or tissue synthesis. Sometimes if the rumen's not working very good, your B vitamins, and a lot of times they'll give a B vitamin shot if they've been sick because of that. A, D, and E. A, reproduction in eyes. D helps with bone development and optimal milk production. And then E works with selenium as an antioxidant and helps muscle development as well. But a lot of times your vitamins are going to be in conjunction with your minerals as well. So kind of touched on this a little bit. Need to consume about 4 ounces of mineral per head per day. And like I said, work with your local feed dealer on that, and they should be able to, and organic trace minerals, because they're going to be more bioavailable. One thing, if you're feeding a lot of byproducts, you want to take that into account when you're putting your mineral together. And like I said, you may need to add a little bit of extra limestone to the diet to balance out that calcium to phosphorus ratio. Keep it in front of them all the time and keep it dry. And we kind of talked a little bit about the loose versus the block. Some other things to think about from a feeding standpoint. We don't want to feed too much corn in the diet from a supplementation standpoint, because that can lead to we call it negative associative effects, but basically we don't get as good forage digestion and forage intake. And so when you're on a diet that's very high in forage, you want to kind of watch that. You don't want to feed over 0.5% of the body, over 0.05% of body weight in that area because of that. And so on a 1,200 pound cow, it's roughly 6 pounds of corn. And corn's typically the one we worry about there. Anything, really any grain's got starch in it would be an issue there. Also on supplementation, your DDGs, corn gluten feed, are high in sulfur, and we want to kind of limit. We don't want to feed a whole lot of those because that can lead to some issues like polio and stuff. And so typically our state beef cattle nutrition extension specialist says we can go as high as 40%, but I don't typically go much over 20 on that, just to leave some room there. And then if you're supplementing, and ionophore is very important. It's a very cheap way to improve performance gain. It also helps in reproduction in females. Also, I didn't put on there, but it's on your wean calves and stuff. It's a good coccidiostat as well. So nitrate, we talked a little bit about that earlier. And then kind of sorting those animals into different feeding groups. And this is based on nutritional needs. Dry cows don't need as much as lactating cows. We talked kind of about the first calf cows versus your older lactating cows and your growing animals. And so if you've got the option to be able to do that, those are kind of the sorts I would make on those and those things. And then analysis of that feeding program through body condition score and then the manure scoring. And so I'll just kind of go through this real quickly because we've spent a lot of time tonight. But basically, when I work with a producer on putting a feeding program together, a ration together, and this kind of is what we kind of talked about the whole evening, is we got to know what that animal that we're feeding. And so we're going to talk about a 1,200 pound early lactation cow, which early lactation is the highest nutrient needs that cow has. And so that's what we're going to look at in this ration that we're going to put together. I'm going to go through pretty quickly here. And we got to know our nutrient requirements. We've got to know what's available. We've got to have we've got to do the nutrient analysis to figure out what's available. And then we've got to match that to her, match the feedstuffs to her requirements. And one of the things that's very important if we've got a supplement is pricing those ingredients on a per unit of dry matter basis, and kind of comparing those from nutritional or from an economic standpoint, and trying to put a supplement in there, supplement as cheap as possible. And Pearson Square is a good, easy way to determine a supplement strategy or put a ration together. You'll have my contact information. I do a lot of them from an Excel spreadsheet too, and that works just as good. But I thought for showing purposes, Pearson Square works pretty, and it's pretty simple, and a lot of people can do that pretty much easier than an Excel spreadsheet. But and then once you have, like we said before, we calculated on a dry matter basis to start with, and then we convert that back to what we're actually going to feed. So we're going to account for the water that we're actually going to feed in that feed, which is the moisture, and then also the wastage. And so this just shows our ingredients and our requirements on our animal. And so we had pretty good, we baled our fescue hay at the proper time. And so it's about 61% TDN. And so when you're doing a Pearson Square, the requirement, and basically I got that requirement by taking the TDN divided by the pounds of dry matter there, the pounds of TDN divided by the pounds of dry matter. And so that's roughly 62% is the requirement of that TDN for that animal. And so we did a good job of baling our fescue hay. We did it at the right time. We got a 61% TDN on that fescue hay. So that almost meets our energy needs. Now, I see a lot of hay tests that aren't that good. So, but we did a good job this time. So we almost met our energy needs with that hay, but we are a little deficient. And so as you can see there, corn's roughly 88% TDN. So that's our ingredient that we're going to utilize to fulfill that energy need. And as you can see there, our ration there to fulfill that cow's energy needs is roughly going to be 96% fescue, 4% corn. And the next part of that component is, did we meet her protein needs? And you can see that there next to it. Well, our fescue was roughly 15% protein. So that was also very good. And so we were well in excess, because I think roughly we were well in excess of protein needs. So we did that. And that if we do a good job of baling our hay, in a lot of instances, we're going to be well in excess of protein. With our cool season grass hays or our cool season grass mixed legume hays, we're going to be well in excess of protein. Energy is typically going to be our issue. And it wasn't. So have we met all of our needs, including minerals? And as we look here, we're a little deficient on meeting that 2-to-1 calcium to phosphorus ratio. And so we needed to add a little bit of limestone to do that, about 0.2 pounds. And this is where we actually do that conversion, where I do that conversion, and I incorporated in the dry matter. And so our hay was 88% dry matter. And so we take that, as I said before, we take that pounds of dry matter, we divide it by the percent dry matter, and then we actually are going to divide it by 10.9, which accounts for 10% wastage. Now, I throw in 10% wastage. That's a number you've got to figure out on your cattle operation. Some people have a lot more wastage. Some people claim they have less wastage than that. And so that's something you've got to figure out. But when we account for all of those factors, we're in this particular ration, we're feeding roughly about 34 pounds of hay. You look at the supplement side there, we've accounted for the dry matter of the supplement, which is roughly 89%. And then we accounted for 5% wastage on the supplement. And so we're roughly feeding about 2 pounds of supplement daily to meet that animal's needs. And one thought here, and that's where when I do an Excel spreadsheet, I probably get a little bit more stricter on this. But and this is a product of grass hays. They're typically higher, as we said, higher in NDF than our legume hays. And so when we one of the things that might be an issue here, and you just kind of have to watch and see how they consume hay, if they're consuming enough, and that's where you look at the indicators, the body condition, and the fecal or and the manure. We're feeding a little more NDF than typically she would be able to consume in that hay, because a cow, older research would say she consumes about 1.2% of her body weight in NDF. And so 14.4 would be that number on a 1,200 pound cow. And we're actually feeding about 17 pounds of NDF. So that's where maybe a little more a legume hay or a mixed grass legume hay to bring that NDF down a little bit. That might, being the high NDF in this fescue hay, might restrict that forage intake a little bit. And so you kind of got to watch that and see. And that's where you kind of look at the performance from that standpoint. But so to kind of wrap up, and basically we look at we need to try to bale that hay at the right maturity, test those resources, and determine your nutrient needs, and determine if those resources meet those nutrient needs, and develop, if they do, then maybe you don't need the supplement, but if you do, develop a supplement strategy around those. And then also one of the ways that we know is that diet actually doing what we think it's going to do is watching the body condition score of the manure. And I know I kind of went through that a little faster at the end, but of course, if you have any questions or need any help related to this, just let us know, and we will be more than happy to work with you on that. So with that, there was one thing about the alfalfa, and I kind of flew through that and forgot to talk about that. But from a hay standpoint, typically alfalfa probably isn't going to cause a bloat issue. We're probably not going to feed enough of it I was just thinking about that. Economically, we're probably not going to feed enough of it that it's going to cause a bloat issue. Typically when we're grazing the alfalfa, and it's only at certain times of the day when it's real early in the morning, it's got a lot of moisture on it, a lot of dew on it. Those are the times of the day when it can be very, you can see a bloat issue, because really bloat with those is going to be high moisture. Alfalfa already, grazing alfalfa already is highly digestible. So high digestible protein, high moisture. Those are the things that lead to bloat. And so with the hay, where it's dried down, and we're not feeding a lot of it in the ration, probably, I don't think you're going to see a lot of bloat issues with that. Now, if you're grazing it, that could be another story. And carboxylene is we can provide that in a supplement or in a block, and that'll help with dealing with those bloat issues. But I think from a hay standpoint, you're not going to see a whole lot of issues with bloat alfalfa hay. But that could be. So with that, sorry we went long here, I think a little bit, but I want to thank you all for being on tonight. Of course, is there any other questions or anything before we quit for this evening and come back on Thursday night?
I don't see any questions in the chat.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for being on tonight, and I will send you guys an email with the handouts. I already sent an email with the handouts for tonight, and prior to Thursday night's talk, I will send another email with the handouts and the information. And that night, Tim Schnockenberg will be on, and I will be on. I'll be talking about feeding, and Tim will be talking about harvesting and storage. And so with that, I'll thank you all for being on this evening, and hopefully it was beneficial. And if you have any questions or anything, just let us know. And with that, we'll see you on Thursday night. So thank you. Also, thank you, Jill and Wesley, for being on tonight. Jill, are you still on?